Hey guys, tonight we are going on a trip that is a little bit crazy. We are going back to 1897 to join the most chaotic, freezing, and desperate rush in human history. The Klondike Gold Rush. But tonight, we aren't chasing the shiny metal. Honestly, statistically speaking, your chances of finding gold are lower than your chances of being eaten by a bear or freezing into a human icicle. Tonight, our mission is simply to stay alive. We are going to talk about something ignored by most adventure novels, but was actually the most important thing in every prospector's life. A jar of sticky, sour, bubbling goo that you have to feed and care for like a newborn baby. Your sourdough starter. Trust me, in the -40-degree wilderness of the Yukon, this jar of paste is going to be more reliable than any human partner you could find. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below and let me know, what city are you in right now and what time is it? And if you are the type of person who keeps weird fermentation projects in your kitchen, like kimchi or a sourdough starter that you've named, leave a East emoji, so I know I am not alone. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Even if you are currently tucked under a warm duvet, I need you to pull your mind back to the summer of 1897. Imagine you are standing on the docks of Seattle. The air is thick, with a strange mixture of smells. Wet wool, freshly sawed lumber, coal smoke, and the distinct odor of thousands of unwashed men sweating out their anxiety. You are clutching a list in your hand, a life or death list. Just a few days ago, a steamship called the Portland pulled into Seattle, carrying a literal ton of gold from the north. The newspaper headlines went insane, screaming, "Gold, gold, gold." And so, naturally, you went insane too. You quit your boring job as a bank teller, or maybe you sold the family farm, and you brought every penny you owned to this muddy, chaotic waterfront. You want to go to the Yukon, you want to get rich. But before you even see a single flake of gold, you are facing a reality that makes your knees weak. Standing in front of you is not a golden path to riches, but a grocery store called Cooper and Levy, and it looks like a riot just happened inside. Shelves are emptied, men are screaming, "I need bacon, give me the fatty stuff. Is this flour dry? If you sell me wet flour, I'll shoot you." You are squeezed into this crush, looking at the official notice posted by the Northwest Mounted Police. The Mounties. This is a mainstream historical fact that defined the entire era. The Canadian government passed a strict law requiring every single person entering the Yukon to bring 1 year's supply of goods. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a law. Why? Because the Yukon is a true wilderness. There are no Walmarts, no convenience stores, and barely any villages. If you city slickers show up without food when winter hits, you will turn into frozen corpses that the Mounties have to dig out of the snow come spring. They didn't want the paperwork. Do you know what a year's supply looks like? It means you need to carry 2,000 pounds, about 907 kilograms, of gear. That is literally a ton. You look at the first item on your mandatory list, flour 400 pounds. Your brain freezes for a second. 400 pounds of flour. That is 8 massive burlap sacks. For the next few months, these 8 sacks will be your best friends and your worst enemies. You will have to carry them on your back over icy mountain passes and float them down dangerous rapids. Here is a niche little fact for you. On that shopping list alongside the flour and bacon was something often listed as evaporated potatoes. These weren't tea-like modern potato chips. They were dehydrated potato chunks that were hard as gravel. Legend has it they tasted like wallpaper paste when boiled. But they were so hard when raw that miners used them as ammunition for slingshots to hunt squirrels. They were apparently better at killing small rodents than they were at being food. You push your way to the counter. The shopkeeper looks exhausted. his eyes wide with the frenzy of capitalism. You point to the mountain of flour sacks behind him. You start counting out your money. Your heart hurts, because the prices are skyrocketing every hour. Academia is actually still debating the role of Seattle in this whole event. Was it a benevolent supply hub or a calculated scam? Historians point to a man named Erastus Brainerd, a genius PR man for the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. He flooded the world with advertisements, claiming Seattle was the only gateway to the Klondike. Some scholars argue this was a massive vampire banquet designed to save Seattle's economy from a depression by fleecing desperate dreamers like you, selling you tons of gear, like Gold Rush-specific bicycles. That would be utterly useless in the snow. But you don't care about marketing conspiracies right now. You only care about that flour. You watch the sacks thud heavily onto the counter, puffing out little clouds of white dust that make you cough. You have to buy them because, up in the frozen north, there is no fresh yeast. Baking powder will go flat in the damp air. If you want bread, if you want pancakes, if you want to eat something other than beans, you are going to rely on an ancient biotechnology. Sourdough. You are going to use this flour to create the only living thing that will belong to you on this trip. You pay the man. You watch your mountain of supplies get piled up on the wet sidewalk: flour, salt pork, beans, dried fruit, and those cursed evaporated potatoes. You feel less like a gold miner and more like a human pack mule. Just then, a light drizzle starts to fall from the gray Seattle sky, dampening the top of your flour sacks. You panic, you rip off your jacket, and throw it over the sacks. This is your first lesson. You can lose the gold, but you cannot let the flour get wet. You sigh, reach into one of the unsealed sacks, and rub a pinch of flour between your fingers. It feels gritty and raw. This is your life now. What you don't know yet is that this pile of dead white powder is about to come alive in your hands. You are sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in a cheap boarding house in Seattle. The room smells like stale tobacco smoke and damp plaster. Outside the window, the rain is still hammering down, turning the streets into rivers of mud. Your 400 pounds of flour are stacked in the corner, taking up more space than you do. But tonight, you aren't worried about the 400 pounds. You are worried about 1 cup of it. You have realized that carrying sacks of flour is useless if you can turn it into bread. And since you can exactly pop down to the corner store for a packet of instant yeast in the Yukon wilderness, you have to play God. You have to create life. You pull out a glass jar. Maybe it's an empty pickle jar you scrounged from the back of a saloon, or a mason jar you bought at Cooper and Levy. You set it on the wobbly bedside table. This is the moment of conception. You take a potato, one of those few fresh ones you haven't dehydrated yet. You boil it in a tin cup over a small alcohol lamp until it falls apart. You mash it up, water and all, into a starchy, cloudy soup. Then, you stir in a cup of your precious flour and a pinch of sugar. You stare at the grayish, lumpy paste. It looks unappealing. It looks like something you used to patch a hole in drywall. But this is the start of your sourdough starter. Here is a mainstream historical fact. Wild yeast is everywhere. You don't need to buy yeast because it is literally floating in the air around you. It's on your skin, on the flour, on the potato skins. By creating this wet, starchy environment, you are building a 5-star hotel for microorganisms. You are inviting the wild yeast and the lactobacillus bacteria, the stuff that makes yogurt sour, to move in, eat the sugar, and reproduce. You cover the jar with a piece of cheesecloth or a dirty handkerchief. Now, you wait for the next 2 days while you pack and repack your gear. You check the jar obsessively. You sleep with one eye open, glancing at the table. At first, nothing happens. It just sits there, looking sad and gray. But then, on the second morning, you see it, a bubble. Then another. The surface of the paste is heaving slightly. It's alive. You lean in and sniff it. This leads to a niche, sensory detail, the sock test. A good starter shouldn't smell like rotting garbage. If it smells like vomit or mold, you've caught the bad bacteria, and you have to throw it out and start over. A healthy starter smells like old beer, or perhaps a pair of gym socks that have been worn for a week, but then sprayed with fruity perfume. It's a yeasty, sharp, alcoholic funk. You take a whiff. It stings your nose hairs. It's perfect. You feel a strange surge of affection. You are about to head into the loneliest place on earth. But you won TB alone. You have this colony of millions of tiny organisms. You decide to name it. This was a common tradition among miners. You don't eat something that has a name, but you do feed it. Maybe you call him Bub, or Pete, or the governor. Let's call him the governor, because he is going to dictate your schedule from now on. But here is where things get scientifically complicated. This brings us to an academic controversy. The San Francisco myth. You've probably heard of San Francisco sourdough. The legend goes that the specific, delicious strain of bacteria, Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis, was unique to the Bay Area fog, and miners brought it north to the Klondike. Camp A, the romance theorists, argues that the miners acted as mules for this specific bacteria, carrying the legendary flavor of California into the Arctic. Camp B, the microbiologists, argues that this is nonsense. They claim that a starter eventually adapts to its local environment. The yeast you capture in a Seattle hotel room is Seattle yeast. Once you get to the Yukon, local Yukon microbes will eventually invade the jar and replace the Seattle ones. So, did the miners bring the culture, or did the culture find them? It's a debate about microbial colonialism. Are you colonizing the Yukon with your yeast, or is the Yukon colonizing your jar? Regardless of the biology, the governor is bubbling away. But now you have a logistical problem. Glass breaks. You look at the jar. It's fragile. If you slip on the ice and land on your pack, you don't just lose your yeast. You get a back full of broken glass and sticky goo. Some miners transferred their starter into a tin can with a wire handle. Others, the brave ones, kept it in a heavy earthenware crock, wrapped in layers of wool. You decide to wrap the jar in your spare long underwear, the red flannel ones. It's soft, it's warm, and it offers padding. You realize that you are swaddling a jar of fermented flour like a baby. But you have to. If the governor freezes solid, the yeast goes dormant. If it freezes too hard and stays that way for months, it might die, though it is surprisingly resilient. If it gets too hot, the yeast cooks and dies instantly. You have to keep him in the Goldilocks zone. You put the swaddled jar into the top of your pack, right where you can reach it. You feed it one last scoop of flour and water. "Eat up, governor," you whisper. "We've got a long boat ride tomorrow." You blow out the kerosene lamp. The rain is still falling outside. But tomorrow you board the steamer heading north. You, your ton of supplies, and your bubbling jar of goo. You are ready, or at least you think you are. But the ocean has a way of testing even the most carefully packed jars. You are standing knee-deep in freezing, gray salt water. The wind is whipping your hair into your eyes, and the sound around you is absolute, unadulterated chaos. Welcome to Dia Beach. The steamship ride was a nightmare of seasickness and overcrowded bunks. But that was luxury compared to this. You see, in 1897, there were no nice piers or cruise ship terminals here. The big ships couldn't get close to the shore because the water was too shallow. So, they anchored a mile out and threw you and your precious ton of gear onto flat-bottomed scows or lighters. Then, the scows brought you as close as they could and basically shoved you off. "Move it, next." A sailor screamed, tossing your 50-pound sack of beans into the mud, like it was a bag of trash. You scrambled after it, splashing through the surf. You dragged the beans to dry land. Then you ran back for the bacon. Then the flour. You have to do this 40 or 50 times. You are essentially playing a game of fetch with a ton of groceries, and the ocean is winning. But amidst all this heavy lifting, your hand keeps flying to your chest, patting the lump under your coat. The governor. You have the glass jar tucked inside your inner pocket now. You were afraid that if you left it in the pack, it would get smashed when the sailors played frisbee with your gear. You can feel the jar against your ribs. It's warm, maybe too warm. You worry that your body heat combined with the exertion is overproofing the yeast. If it rises too fast, the pressure will build up and the lid might pop off. Leaving you covered in sour goo, you gently burp the jar, unscrewing the lid slightly to let the gas escape, while dragging a crate of evaporated potatoes with your other hand. It is a delicate multitasking act, heavy labor mixed with microbiology. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact that caused more panic than the bears. The Dia tides. The tidal range at the head of the Lynn Canal is massive, sometimes over 20 feet, 6 meters. The water doesn't just creep in. It races. You look down the beach. It's a scene of panic. Thousands of prospectors are running back and forth. Why? Because they dumped their supplies at low tide, thinking they were safe. Now, the tide is coming in, and the ocean is eating their flour. You see a man screaming as a wave washes over his sacks of sugar. That sugar is gone. Dissolved. He is out of the game before he even started. You frantically pile your gear higher up the beach, well above the drift line. You are sweating. Despite the cold wind, you sit down on your stack of flour sacks, gasping for air. You look around at the town of Da. It's barely a town. It's a chaotic shanty town of tents, false front trading posts, and mud. So much mud. This leads to a niche, sensory detail. The smell of Da. Diaries from the time describe a very specific odor. It wasn't just salt and pine. It was the smell of wet dog and rotting horse feed. Thousands of horses were offloaded here. Many were cheap, sick animals bought by naive miners who thought they could ride to the gold fields. These poor creatures were often neglected, standing in the tidal mud, their feed mixing with the muck. It created a unique pungent aroma that stuck to your clothes for weeks. You take a breath and you taste the manure. You check on the governor again. You pull the jar out slightly. The mixture is bubbly and frothy. The shaking from the boat ride and the landing has actually aerated it nicely. It looks vigorous. It smells sharp like a strong apple cider vinegar. It likes the adventure so far. But now, you have to make a choice. You are at Da because you chose the Chilkoot Trail. This brings us to a massive academic and historical controversy, Skagway versus Da. A few miles over is the town of Skagway, the starting point of the White Pass Trail. Campa, the White Pass defenders, argued that the White Pass was lower and allowed for pack animals, horses the whole way. They called it the Animal Trail. Camp B, the Chilkoot defenders. That SU argued that the White Pass was a narrow, muddy death trap. In fact, so many horses died there, it was nicknamed the Dead Horse Trail. Historians still debate which route was objectively better. The White Pass was technically less steep, but it was a muddy bog that swallowed animals whole. The Chilkoot was steeper, insanely steep, but it was direct. It was the poor man's route, because you could take a horse over the summit. You had to carry everything on your own back. You chose the Chilkoot because you are poor, and you trust your legs more than a sick horse. But looking up at the mountains looming ahead, you start to doubt yourself. Those mountains are a wall, a white, icy wall. You set up your small canvas tent on the rocky beach. You drag your supplies inside to protect them from the rain. It's dinner time. You are too tired to cook beans. You look at the jar. All right, Governor, you whisper, showtime. You scoop out a cup of the starter into a tin pan. It's gooey and elastic. You add a little more flour and water to the jar to feed the governor, replacing what you took. This is the eternal cycle. Take some, feed some, then, to the goo in the pan, you add a pinch of salt and a spoonful of baking soda. Fizz. The acid in the sourdough reacts with the baking soda. The batter puffs up instantly. This is the sourdough pancake trick. You don't have time to wait for bread to rise for hours. You use the flavor of the sourdough, but the lift of the soda. You fry it over a small driftwood fire. It's not pretty. It's burnt on the edges and doughy in the middle. But you take a bite. It's sour, it's chewy. It tastes like civilization. It's the best thing you've ever eaten. You sit in the door of your tent, watching the tide swallow the beach where you were standing an hour ago. You see other miners eating cold beans from a can, looking at your steaming pancake with envy. You realize that in this lawless, chaotic place, owning a jar of yeast makes you a king. But the easy part is over. Tomorrow, you have to move this mountain of food. You have to move 2,000 pounds of gear, 400 pounds of flour, and 1 glass jar, up the river toward the pass. And the jar is getting heavy. Not physically, but mentally. You realize that if you trip and break it, you lose your pancakes, you lose your bread, you lose your comfort. You wrap the jar back in the red flannel underwear and shove it deep into your sleeping bag. You are going to sleep with it. "Good night, Governor," you mutter. Outside, the wind howls, and the smell of wet horses drifts through the tent flaps. You are standing at the base of a wall of white. It isn't a vertical cliff, but it feels like one. This is the Chilkoot Pass. They call it the Golden Staircase, which is a cruel joke because there is absolutely nothing golden about it. It is a 45-degree slope of ice and packed snow that rises 1,000 feet straight up into the clouds, and you have a math problem. Remember your 1 ton of supplies? You can only carry about 50 or 60 pounds on your back at a time without your knees exploding. Do the math. To move 2,000 pounds of gear up this mountain, you have to make roughly 40 trips. This brings us to the most soul-crushing reality of the Klondike gold rush, the human yo-yo. You don't just walk to the Yukon. You walk 1 mile, dump your 50-pound pack in the snow, and walk back. Then you pick up the next 50 pounds, walk the same mile, and dump it. You do this 40 times for every single mile of the trail. Historians estimate that to move a 1-year outfit across the 33-mile trail, a prospector actually walked about 2,500 miles. You are essentially walking from New York to Los Angeles just to move your groceries over a hill. But while your beans and your flour can sit comfortably in the snowbank while you go back for the next load, the governor cannot. If you leave your sourdough jar in the snow cache for even an hour, the yeast will go dormant. If it freezes solid and the glass cracks, it's game over. So, the jar has to stay with you. Always you tuck the jar inside your heavy wool mackinaw coat, right against your innermost layer of flannel, pressed against your chest. You can feel it there. It's a cold, heavy lump at first, but your body heat slowly warms it. As you trudge up the slope, sweating in the freezing air, you are acting as a human incubator. This leads to a niche sensory detail, the sourdough smell. As the yeast warms up from your body heat, it gets active. It starts to ferment. You are hiking, gasping for air, and every time you look down, you catch a whiff of strong, boozy fermentation rising from your cleavage. You smell like a walking brewery. It's a comforting smell. Honestly, it reminds you that life is persisting right there inside your jacket. You join the line. You look up. The Golden Staircase is actually a line of 1,500 steps carved into the ice. There is a single, continuous line of men and a few women climbing up. It looks like a colony of black ants marching up a sugar cube. The rule is simple: keep moving. If you stop, you block the line. If you are too tired, you have to step out of the single-track groove and stand in the deep, soft snow to the side. But getting back in, good luck. The line never stops. You might stand there shivering for an hour before a sympathetic soul lets you cut back in. So you march, step, breath, step, breath. You stare at the boots of the man in front of you. He is wearing cheap rubber boots that are probably frozen to his toes. You are thankful for your mooklooks. You can hear the sound of the pass. It's not wind, it's the sound of 1,000 men wheezing, coughing, and the squeak crunch of boots on hard-packed snow. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact, the Tlingit Packers. You see some men who aren't carrying 50 pounds. They are carrying 100, maybe 200 pounds. They are moving faster than you. These are the Tlingit people, the indigenous inhabitants of this region. They saw you fools coming and turned it into a business. They charge by the pound at the height of the rush. The rate hit $1 per pound to carry gear over the pass. Do the math. To carry your ton of gear would cost $2,000. That's about $70,000 in today's money. You are poor. You are the pack mule. You watch them fly past you with envy. But is this route actually safe? This leads to a massive academic controversy, the avalanche debate. For a long time, the Chilkoot was marketed as the safe route compared to the White Pass, which was a muddy death trap for horses. The Chilkoot was just steep, but was it safe? On Palm Sunday, the 3rd of April, 1898, a series of massive avalanches struck the Chilkoot. Campa, the fatalists, argue that the miners were warned by the Tlingit Packers. The indigenous porters stopped working that day. They looked at the warm weather and the heavy snow load and said, "Number the mountain is angry." Camp B, the ignorant rush, argues that the miners were so obsessed with gold, so terrified of being left behind, that they ignored the warnings. They kept climbing. The snow let go. It buried the trail under 50 feet of concrete, hard snow. About 60 people died. Historians argue, was this a natural disaster or a disaster of greed? If they had just listened to the locals, they would have lived. But today, on your climb, the snow holds. You reach the scales, a flat area just before the final, brutal vertical ascent. You dump your load of flour. You turn around. You slide down the mountain. Yes, people literally slid down on their butts to save time, to get the next load, but the governor stays with you. On the way down, the wind cuts through your coat. You instinctively wrap your arms around your chest, protecting the jar. You care more about that yeast than you do about your own frozen fingers. By the time you haul your final load to the summit, it is night. You are standing at the top of the world. The wind is howling like a banshee. You are surrounded by a chaotic pile of goods. Thousands of tons of supplies, dumped by thousands of exhausted men. You find your pile. You collapse onto a sack of beans. You pull the jar out of your coat to check on it. It's warm. It's bubbly. It has survived the ascent. You, on the other hand, are wrecked. Your legs are shaking uncontrollably, but you can rest yet. You look ahead. There is a small wooden shack half buried in the snow. A British Union Jack flag, or the Canadian Red Ensign, is snapping violently in the wind. A man in a red serge coat and a fur hat is standing there, holding a clipboard. It's the Northwest Mounted Police. You have climbed the mountain, but now you have to pass the exam. If he decides you don't have enough food, or if he just doesn't like your face, he can turn you around. He can send you back down the stairs. You hide the yeast jar back inside your coat. You pat it for luck. Don't bubble too loud. "Governor," you whisper, "we've got to clear customs." You are standing in front of the most terrifying structure in the entire Yukon. It is Inns Tia Cliff, and it isn't Tia Bear Den. It is a small, wooden shack sitting precariously on the wind-swept summit of the Chilkoot Pass. A Union Jack flag, technically the Canadian Red Ensign, is frozen stiff in the gale, pointing north like a rigid finger. Standing beneath it, is a man who looks completely out of place. While you are covered in mud, soot, and frozen snot, wearing layers of mismatched wool that make you look like a homeless scarecrow, this man is immaculate. He is wearing the scarlet tunic of the Northwest Mounted Police, a fur cap, and boots that somehow look polished. He is the gatekeeper, and he holds the power of God, or at least the power of the Queen, over your fate. This brings us to a mainstream historical reality, the one-ton law enforcement. We mentioned earlier that you had to bring a year's supply of food, but buying it in Seattle was the easy part. Getting it past this guy is the hard part. The Canadian government, led here by the legendary Superintendent Sam Steele, a man whose name sounds like an action hero and who acted like one, was terrified of a humanitarian disaster. They knew that if thousands of starving Americans got stuck in the Yukon winter, it would be an international nightmare. So, they set up a checkpoint at the absolute worst possible location, the summit of a mountain, to physically stop anyone who was light. You watch the man ahead of you. He is arguing. "I have money," the man shouts. "I can buy food in Dawson." The Mountie doesn't even blink. "There is no food in Dawson to buy, sir. Turn around." "But I climbed the stairs. I made 30 trips. Then you have a nice walk down next." The man is turned away, just like that. His dream is dead because he did. Bring enough beans, you step forward. Your heart is hammering against your ribs, right next to the glass jar tucked in your coat. The governor feels warm against your skin, a secret contraband of life. The Mountie looks at you. He looks at your pile of goods dumped in the snow. "Manifest?" he asks. You hand him your soggy, crumpled list from Cooper and Levy. He scans it. 400 pounds of flour? "Yes, sir." "Show me." You point to your stack of sacks, half buried in a snowdrift. He walks over. He doesn't weigh them. He can weigh 20 million pounds of gear that pass through here. He uses the eyeball audit. He kicks a sack. He lifts a crate. He is looking for dummies, boxes filled with sawdust or snow that lazy prospectors use to fake the weight. This leads to a niche, slightly terrifying fact. The Summit Maxim gun. You might notice something metal glinting near the shack. It isn't a surveying tool. It is a Maxim machine gun. The Mounties were outnumbered thousands to one by a mob of desperate, armed American men. To ensure peace, order, and good government, Sam Steele placed a rapid-fire machine gun at the top of the pass. It was the ultimate "do not argue with the manager" sign. It pointed down the trail, a silent reminder that Canadian law was not a suggestion. The Mountie returns to you. He looks skeptical. "You have the flour," he says. "But do you know how to use it? We have too many greenhorns dying of scurvy and starvation because they don't know how to bake bread. They eat raw flour paste and get sick." This is your moment. You reach into your coat. You pull out the bundle of red flannel. You slowly unwrap it. The Mountie raises an eyebrow. He probably thinks you are pulling out a weapon or a flask of whiskey. Instead, you reveal the jar. The mixture inside is bubbling happily. You unscrew the lid. A pungent, sharp aroma of yeast and alcohol wafts out, cutting through the crisp, cold mountain air. It smells like a bakery in a brewery. The Mountie sniffs. His stern face cracks. A small smile appears. "Sourdough," he says, "and it is active." "Yes, sir. Kept it warm all the way from DA." "Good," he nods. He stamps your paper. "That jar is worth more than the gold you are looking for. Move along." You scramble to pack your jar away before it freezes. You passed. You are officially in Canada. But wait, where exactly is Canada? This brings us to a massive academic controversy. The Alaska boundary dispute. You are standing at the summit. The Mounties claimed this was the border. The Americans claimed the border was actually 30 miles further inland, near Lake Bennett. The Canadians claimed the border was 30 miles further south, near the ocean. Why does this matter? If the border was at the ocean, Canada would have a port. They could control the trade. If the border was inland, The U.S. controlled the ports, Skagway and DA, and could tax the Canadians. By setting up the machine gun at the summit, Canada effectively created a fact on the ground. They drew a line in the snow and dared the U.S. to cross it. Historians argue that the Klondike gold rush was the catalyst that finally forced a resolution, which eventually favored the U.S., much to Canada's anger. But right now, on this snowy peak, the border is wherever the guy with the machine gun says it is. You are through. But now you face a new physics problem. You have moved 2,000 pounds up 1,000 feet. Now you have to move it down. And the other side of the Chilkoot isn't a staircase. It is a slide. You look down. The trail drops away into a snowy abyss toward a frozen lake far below. Miners are sitting on their shovels, using them as sleds, sliding down the mountain at breakneck speeds, screaming with joy or terror. You have to get your flour down there, and you have to get the governor down there without smashing him into a million sticky pieces. You decide to carry the yeast on your person again. You can risk putting it on a sled. You load a few sacks of flour onto a small wooden sled. You push it off. It rockets down the hill. Now it is your turn. You sit on your rear end. You clutch the jar to your chest like a football. You push off. The wind rushes past your ears. You are sliding down a mountain in Canada, holding a jar of bacterial culture, surrounded by men sliding on shovels. It is the most absurd moment of your life. For a few seconds, you aren't a minner. You are a child playing in the snow. You hit the bottom in a spray of white powder. You check your chest. The jar is intact. The governor is just shaken, not stirred. You stand up and look out at the landscape before you, Lake Bennett. It is a vast frozen white plain surrounded by mountains. This is the bottleneck. The trail ends here. To get to the gold fields, you can walk anymore. The ice is melting, or will be soon. You have to build a boat. But look around. Do you see any trees? Number, because the 10,000 men who arrived before you already cut them all down. You have a ton of food, a jar of yeast, and a frozen lake. But if you want to leave this place, you are going to have to walk another 10 miles just to find a tree to cut down. And while you wait for the ice to melt, you are going to do a lot of baking. You are now a resident of the strangest city on earth. It is a city made of white canvas tents, populated by 20,000 men, all waiting for a single event: the ice to melt. Welcome to Lake Bennett. You have successfully dragged your ton of flour and your precious jar of yeast over the mountains. The Yukon River, your highway to the gold, is currently a solid block of ice. And even when it melts, you can just swim to Dawson. You need a boat. But there is no Home Depot here. There is no boat dealership. If you want a boat, you have to build it from scratch. This brings us to the most hated relationship, destroying activity in the history of the Klondike: whipsawing. You look around the camp. It is a forest of stumps. The 10,000 people who arrived before you have cut down every tree within a 5-mile radius. You and your partner had to hike 7 miles back into the hills, cut down spruce trees, and drag them back to the frozen lake. Now you have logs, but a boat isn't made of logs. It's made of planks. So you build a scaffold. You roll a log onto it. One man stands on top of the log. The other man stands underneath, in the pit. You take a massive 6-foot-long steel saw. The man on top pulls up. The man on the bottom pulls down. Rip. It takes hours to cut a single plank. The man on top, the top sawyer, has to guide the blade straight. The man on bottom, the pitman, gets a face full of sawdust every time he looks up. It is brutal, back-breaking, repetitive torture. Legend says that more partnerships broke up at Lake Bennett than anywhere else in the world. Best friends who had known each other since kindergarten would draw guns on each other over a crooked cut. This leads to a massive academic controversy. The sawing the boat in half myth. There is a famous story repeated in almost every history book and novel about the Klondike, about a pair of partners who hated each other so much by the time the boat was finished that they literally sawed the boat in half. One took the bow, the other took the stern, or they counted out the nails and split the flour grain by grain. Historians debate, did this actually happen? Camp A, the folklore enthusiasts, says yes, citing oral traditions and the sheer madness of the era. Camp B, the skeptics, argues that this is physically impossible. A half-boat doesn't float. They argue these stories are metaphors for the extreme psychological stress of the Bennett weight. The sawing the boat is a myth that represents the fracturing of the human psyche under pressure. Whether they sawed the boat or just walked away, you can see the tension in the eyes of the men around you. They are tired. They are bored. They are angry. You and your partner are currently not speaking. He is the top sawyer, and he keeps yelling at you to pull harder. You are the pitman, and you are currently spitting sawdust out of your mouth. You decide to take a break. It's lunchtime. You are too tired to build a fire pit. You look at your shovel. The same shovel you used to dig out the tent platform. You wipe it clean in the snow. You grease it with a piece of bacon rind. You hold it over the fire. It is time to wake up the governor. You pull the jar from your sleeping bag. It has been fermenting aggressively in the slightly warmer air of the tent city. It smells potent, a sharp, vinegary tang that cuts through the smell of sawdust and unwashed bodies. You pour a cup of the gray, bubbly goo into a tin mug. You add a handful of flour and a splash of water to the jar to keep the governor alive. Then, to the mug, you add the magic ingredient, baking soda saleratus. Fizz, the chemistry happens instantly. The acetic acid in the sourdough reacts with the alkali soda. The batter foams up, doubling in size. You pour this frothy mixture onto the hot, greased shovel blade. Hiss, this brings us to a niche, culinary necessity, the bannock versus sourdough hotcake. Distinction: bannock is a simple, unleavened, or baking powder. Bread cooked in a frying pan. It's dense. It sits in your stomach like a brick. But what you are making, the sourdough hotcake, is a delicacy. The reaction creates air pockets. It makes the cake light. You flip it with a knife. It's golden brown, with crispy, bacon fat edges. You slide it off the shovel onto a tin plate. You pour a little molasses or syrup over it, if you haven't eaten it all yet. You take a bite. It is sour. It is sweet. It is smoky. For a moment, you forget the sawdust in your eyes. You forget that you hate your partner. You forget that you are stuck on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. This is the power of the sourdough. It is morale in edible form. You look over at your partner. He is sitting on a stump, looking miserable. You slide a second shovel cake onto a plate and hand it to him. He takes it, he nods, he eats. The tension breaks. The yeast has mediated the dispute. Okay, he grumbles with his mouth full. Let's finish that last log. But the waiting isn't just about sawing. It's about listening. Every night, you lie in your tent and listen to the lake. Boom, crack. The ice is groaning. It is shifting. Spring is coming. The breakup is inevitable. When that ice cracks, 7,000 handmade boats, rafts, scows, canoes, and floating coffins will launch at the same time. It will be the greatest regatta of incompetence the world has ever seen. You check the governor one last time. You tighten the lid. You have survived the mountain. You have survived the sawing. But now, you have to survive the water. And looking at the Frankenboat you just built, with its crooked planks and leaky seams, you realize that keeping a jar of yeast dry in the middle of a rapid is going to be a whole new challenge. You clean your shovel. You put out the fire. Tomorrow, the ice goes out. Tomorrow, the race begins. The ice has cracked. It sounded like a cannon shot echoing across the valley. And just like that, the waiting is over. On May 29, 1898, the great blockade of Lake Bennett broke. Within 48 hours, over 7,000 handmade boats, scows, rafts, canoes, and things that looked like floating coffins, pushed off from the shore. You are one of them. You and your partner shove your whipsawed, leaky boat into the water. It's heavy, loaded down with your ton of beans, bacon, and flour. But as you push off into the current, you aren't checking the seams of the boat. You are checking the padding on a specific box lashed near the center of the vessel. Inside that box, wrapped in your spare wool socks, is the governor. You have realized a terrifying truth. If the boat flips, you can swim. If the flour gets wet, the outer layer forms a paste that protects the inner flour, mostly. But if that glass jar smashes against a rock, it's over. You can scrape yeast off a river rock. The lineage ends. The pancakes stop. So, as you steer your clumsy barge down the Yukon River, your eyes are constantly darting to that box. The first few miles are deceptive. The river is wide and lazy. You float along feeling like Huckleberry Finn. But then, you see a flag on the bank, a red warning flag, and you hear a sound. It sounds like a freight train coming toward you. Miles Canyon. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact, the funnel effect. The Yukon River is usually wide, but at Miles Canyon, the entire volume of the river is suddenly squeezed between vertical walls of basalt rock, only 100 feet apart. The water accelerates from a lazy drift to a terrifying fire hose jet. The water in the canyon is crowned in the center. It's actually higher in the middle than on the sides, because of the pressure. If you slide off the crown, you hit the wall. If you hit the wall, your boat splinters like a matchstick. You see a crowd of boats pulled over to the bank ahead. People are walking. They are lining their boats, using ropes to drag them empty through the canyon while walking on the cliffs. It's safe, but it's slow. You look at your partner. He looks at you. "We run it," he asks. "We run it." You agree. You are too tired to unload 2,000 pounds of gear again. But before you enter the chute, you encounter the boss level of the Klondike again, Superintendent Sam Steele. This leads to a niche, bureaucratic intervention. The no women or children rule in the first few days of the breakup. Roughly 150 boats wrecked in the canyon. People drowned. It was a disaster. Sam Steele, watching from the bank, decided he had seen enough stupidity. He issued an order. No boat enters the rapids without a competent pilot. And absolutely no women or children are allowed in the boats. They must walk around. He levied a fine of $100 if you disobeyed. He essentially turned the wildest stretch of river in North America into a regulated theme park ride. You row toward the police checkpoint. The Mountie looks at your boat. It's ugly, but it looks sturdy. "Do you know how to steer?" He barks. "Yes, sir." You lie. He waves you through. You enter the canyon. The world goes dark as the basalt walls rise up 50 feet on either side. The noise is deafening. The water grabs your boat and hurls it forward. You are screaming instructions to your partner. "Left. Paddle left." The boat shudders. Waves crash over the bow, soaking your flour sacks. But you don't care about the flour. You instinctively throw your body over the center box. You are a human shield for a jar of yeast. If you hit a rock, you want your ribs to break before the glass does. You shoot out of the canyon like a cork from a champagne bottle. You spin in the eddy. You survived. But you don't have time to celebrate, because right after Miles Canyon comes the White Horse Rapids. This name comes from the foam. The water is so turbulent, it looks like the mane of a galloping white horse. This brings us to a massive academic controversy. The Jack London myth. The famous author Jack London was here. He was a 21-year-old adventurer, just like you. Later, he would write that he made $3,000, a fortune, piloting boats through these rapids, because he was such a skilled sailor. Campa, the literary fans, believes him. They see London as a natural Superman of the wilderness. Camp B, the historians, looks at the records. They argue London probably piloted a few boats, but the $3,000 figure is a massive exaggeration. Typical author math. There were professional pilots, mostly Tlingit men or experienced sailors, who charged $25 a boat. For London to make $3,000, he would have had to pilot 120 boats in a few days without sleeping. Did he actually dominate the rapids, or did he just write a good story about it later? You aren't, T. Jack London. You are just terrified. You hit the white horse. The boat bucks. It feels like you are riding a bull. A massive wave slams into the side. The boat tips. The box with the governor, slides. You lunge for it. You catch it just before it hits the gunwale. You hold it tight with one hand while gripping the tiller with the other. You are steering a 1-ton boat through a Class IV rapid one-handed. The adrenaline makes time slow down. You see the rocks. You see the foam. You see the fragile glass of the jar in your mind. SI. And then, it's over. The river widens. The roar fades behind you. You drift into calm water. You are shaking. You are soaked to the bone. Your partner is bailing water out of the boat with a bucket. We made it, he gasps. Did we lose anything? You open the box. You unwrap the wet socks. There sits the jar. It looks unimpressed. In fact, the violent shaking of the rapids has acted like a superfeed. The mixture is incredibly bubbly. It has risen halfway up the jar. The governor enjoyed the ride. You unscrew the lid to let the gas escape. Pea-shaped. It smells alive. You laugh. It's a hysterical, high-pitched laugh. You just risked your life to save a condiment. But you aren't at Dawson yet. You have another 500 miles of river to go. And while the rapids are behind you, a new enemy is waiting. Mosquitoes and the sheer, mind-numbing boredom of drifting. You look at the jar. You realize you need to bake something to celebrate. But you can bake on a moving boat. You have to wait for camp. And when you get to Dawson, you are going to find out that this jar is practically a license to print money. Because in Dawson, an egg costs more than a shot of whiskey. You drift around the final bend of the Yukon River. Your hands are blistered, your back is spasming, and you smell like a wet dog that has been sleeping in a campfire. But then, you see it. Rising out of the swampy confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers is a chaotic, sprawling mess of white tents and raw timber cabins. Smoke hangs low over the valley. The sound of thousands of hammers hitting nails echoes off the canyon walls. Dawson City, the Paris of the North, the city of gold. You steer your battered boat toward the mudflats. You jam your pole into the silt. You tie off the rope. You have arrived. You have survived the ocean, the mountain, the avalanche, and the rapids. You are technically a hero of the wilderness. But as you step off the boat, you don't feel like a hero. You feel like you are sinking. Literally. This brings us to the defining architectural feature of Dawson. The mud. You step onto Front Street, and your boot disappears. The mud in Dawson is not just dirt and water. It is a geological event. The city is built on permafrost. Frozen ground. When 30,000 people showed up and built fires and heated cabins, the ground melted. The result was a slurry of bog sewage and horse manure that was reportedly 3 feet deep in places. There are stories of mules falling into the street and drowning in the mud. There are stories of men walking on boardwalks and seeing a hat floating in the mud, only to lift it up and find a man underneath who says, Don't worry, I am riding a horse." You drag yourself out of the muck and head toward a sign that says, "Restaurant." You are sick of beans. You are sick of bacon. You want a civilized meal. You want an egg, a fried egg, with a yolk that runs. You walk in. It's a tent with a sawdust floor. Men are eating silently, guarding their plates with their arms. You look at the menu chalked on a slate. Fresh egg, $5. You blink. You rub your eyes. $5 in 1898. The average daily wage for a worker in America was about 1.5. Oh. ASINGLE. EGGIND. AWSON. Coast, Sthreeday, Syntotday, Smoney, Thatisrougly, Y2025. Oh, a single guinea costs 3 days. Wages in today's money. That is roughly 150 for one egg. You look at your wallet. You look at your stomach. You realize that the civilized breakfast is a fantasy. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact, the hyperinflation of the Klondike. Dawson was the end of the line. Everything had to be carried over the same mountain you just climbed, or brought up the river by steamer in the short summer season. Supply was low, demand was infinite. Salt was weight for weight with gold. Nails were worth more than bullets, and fresh food, it was a status symbol. If you saw a man eating a fried egg, you knew he was either the king of the Klondike or a fool who would be broke by Tuesday. But here is a niche, slightly stomach-churning detail. The fresh egg, even if you paid the $5. The egg was tea fresh. It had traveled from Seattle or Vancouver. It was months old to preserve them. Merchants coated the eggs in beeswax or buried them in barrels of oats. Or, in winter, they arrived frozen solid. There was a specific culinary term in Dawson for a good egg versus a bad egg. A bad egg was just rotten. A good egg was one that, when cracked, didn't smell too much like sulfur. Miners often ordered their eggs scrambled, because if you ordered it sunny side up, you would see the yolk was flat and gray. Scrambling hid the decay. You were paying $150 to eat a gray, semi-rotten omelet. You walk out of the restaurant. You are hungry, but you aren't stupid. You trudge back to your boat. You look at your supplies. You have flour, you have water, and you have the governor. You realize the true value of that glass jar wrapped in socks. Your sourdough starter is an inflation-proof machine. It doesn't need eggs. It doesn't need milk. It doesn't need baking powder, which was selling for $1 a can, and often turned out to be fake white dust. All the governor needs is flour and water and time. You sit on a crate in the mud, you pull out the jar. It's bubbling away, indifferent to the economics of the gold rush. You mix up a batter, you don't. To make fancy pastries, you make the staple of the North, sourdough hotcakes. You cook them on a tin plate over a driftwood fire. They are fluffy, they are tangy, and most importantly, they are essentially free, since you already own the flour. As you eat, you watch a man in a silk vest walk by, looking miserable. He probably just spent $50 on a steak that was tough as leather. You are eating better than him. This economic disparity leads to a massive academic controversy. The miners theory, who actually got rich in the Klondike. Camp A, the traditional narrative, focuses on the Klondike kings, men like Big Alex McDonald or Swiftwater Bill Gates, who struck gold and pulled millions from the ground. Camp B, the economic historians, argues that the miners were actually the victims. The real winners were the merchants, men like Joe Ledoux, who founded Dawson City. He didn't dig for gold. He staked the land, built a sawmill, and sold liquor. Or Arizona Charlie Meadows, who built the Palace Grand Theater. The theory is that the gold rush was a wealth transfer event, not from the ground to the miners, but from the miners' savings accounts in Seattle to the merchants' pockets. The miners were just the labor force used to transport wealth into the hands of the shopkeepers. You, eating your pancake, are disrupting this flow. By refusing to buy the $5 egg, you are opting out of the scam. You finish your meal, you feel better, but you can stay on the boat forever. You need shelter. You look up at the hills surrounding the city. They are stripped bare of trees. You need a cabin. But winter is coming. The sun is already dipping lower every day. And while you have mastered the art of keeping the governor warm against your body, how do you keep him warm when the temperature drops to -50 degrees? When the air turns into liquid ice, you are about to enter the long dark. Dawson is fun in the summer, if you like mud. But in the winter, it becomes a frozen prison, and your relationship with your sourdough starter is about to get very intimate. Because when the fire goes out at 3 a.m., the only place safe for a glass jar of yeast is inside your sleeping bag, right next to your skin. You pack up your cooking gear. You head toward the hillside to stake a spot for your tent. The mud sucks at your boots with every step. Squelch, squelch, don't worry, governor, you mutter. We'll find a dry spot. Eventually, you wake up with a start. The silence is absolute. It is heavy, pressing against your ears like water. You open your eyes, but there is nothing to see. It is pitch black. You fumble for your watch. It is 10 a.m. Welcome to the long dark. The sun, which beat down on you relentlessly during the summer mud season, has now abandoned you. In the depths of the Yukon winter, the sun might drag itself above the horizon for a few lazy hours around noon, casting a weak, twilight gloom, before dropping back down like it's too tired to bother. But the darkness is what woke you. It was the cold. The fire in your small Yukon stove has died. The temperature inside your 10 times 12 log cabin is plummeting. You can hear the cabin itself reacting. The logs are contracting in the intense cold, letting out sharp pistol shot cracks. Bang! That echo like gunfire you exhale. Your breath turns into a cloud of ice crystals that falls instantly onto your blankets. This is what the old-timers call the white silence. You reach out a hand to the water bucket standing near the stove. It is solid ice, not just a crust. It's a block. If you tried to drink from the dipper, your lips would stick to the metal and tear off. It is currently roughly minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 45 degrees Celsius outside. At this temperature, mercury thermometers stop working. Pain is a sensation. It's an atmosphere. If you spit, the saliva freezes before it hits the ground with a distinct click. But you don't care about the water bucket. You care about the lump in your sleeping bag. You reach down to your stomach. You feel the smooth, round glass of the jar. It is warm. This brings us to the most intimate relationship of your life, sleeping with the sourdough. During the day, the governor sits on a shelf behind the stove, basking in the radiant heat. But at night, when the fire dies, that shelf becomes a kill zone. If the yeast freezes solid in a glass jar, the water inside expands, and the jar explodes. You would wake up to shards of glass and a frozen block of dead culture, so you have to bring it to bed. This leads to a niche sensory reality, the bedroom bouquet. Let's be honest, you haven't tea-bathed since October. You are wearing 3 layers of wool long underwear that you sleep in, work in, and cook in. You smell like wood smoke, sweat, and unwashed human, but the governor, he smells worse or better, depending on your perspective. As your body heat warms the jar under the covers, the fermentation accelerates. The jar burps gas, a pungent, boozy, vinegary aroma wafts up from your sleeping bag, mixing with the smell of your dirty socks. It is the perfume of survival to a Chichaco newcomer. It's disgusting. To you, it smells like breakfast. You lie there in the dark, hugging the jar. You realize that this single-celled organism is the only living thing within 10 miles that relies on you. This brings us to a massive academic controversy: the cabin fever psychology. Historians and psychologists have long studied the mental breakdown of miners during the Klondike winter. Men went mad. They walked into the snow and never came back. They shot their partners for snoring. Campa, the isolationists, argues that the sensory deprivation, the darkness, the silence, the cold, broke their minds. The brain needs stimulus, and without it, it hallucinates. Camp B, the routine theorists, argues that the men who survived, the sourdoughs, did so because they anthropomorphized their routine. They turned their sourdough starter into a pet. By having to feed the jar, warm the jar, and protect the jar, You maintained a schedule. You had a purpose. You weren't just a guy freezing in the dark. You were a guardian. So, did the sourdough actually save your sanity by giving you a Wilson like in the movie Cast Away to care for? Or was it just a calorie source? You stroke the jar. You whisper, "Morning, Governor. Cold one today." You are definitely in Camp B. You muster the courage to get up. You launch yourself out of the sleeping bag, grabbing your matches. You light the kindling. The stove roars to life. You wait for the ice in the bucket to melt. You look at your flour supply. It's getting low. You started with 400 pounds. But you've been eating huge stacks of flapjacks every day because the cold burns calories like a furnace. You are eating 4,000, maybe 5,000 calories a day just to stay warm. You look at the sourdough jar. It looks hungry. It's a hoochie gray color. You need to feed it, but you are scared to use your good white flour. What if you run out before the river melts in May? You look at the corner of the cabin. There is a bag of oats for the mules if you had mules. There is some cornmeal. There is some cornmeal. There is sawdust. You start to wonder, how picky is the governor? Does he really need pure wheat flour? Or can you stretch him? Can you cut the product? This is the beginning of the starvation baking phase. The luxury of the Seattle shopping spree is over. Now, you are a mad scientist in a frozen lab. You are about to find out just how resilient this culture really is. You are going to start feeding it things that no yeast should ever have to eat. And you are going to pray it doesn't die of indigestion. You mix a little cornmeal into the jar. The governor bubbles skeptically, then accepts it. You survive another breakfast. But as you look out the frosted window at the endless gray twilight, you realize the cold isn't the only thing creeping in. The silence is getting louder. You need to talk to someone. Anyone. But the only person you can talk to is a jar of paste. And the scariest part, sometimes you think you can hear it talking back. You are standing in your cabin, staring into the open mouth of a burlap sack. It is a sight that makes your stomach drop faster than the temperature outside. The bottom of the sack is visible. You give it a shake. A small cloud of white dust puffs up, a ghost of the abundance you had in Seattle. You stick your tin cup in and scrape the corners. You get maybe 3 cups of flour. That's it. It is February. The ice on the Yukon River won. Tea break until May. You have 3 months of winter left, and you have enough flour for maybe 2 days of pancakes. Panic begins to set in. Not the screaming kind, but the cold, calculating kind. You look at the governor. The jar is sitting on the table, bubbling expectantly. He is hungry. He demands his daily tribute of starch. If you don't feed him, the yeast goes dormant, then autolyzes, eats itself, and turns into a black, watery grave. You can let him die. If he dies, you are reduced to eating boiled beans for 90 days. You will lose your mind. So, you decide to become a criminal. You are going to commit fraud against your own stomach. You are going to cut the product. This brings us to the art of adulteration. You look around the cabin for anything that resembles flour. You have a bag of cornmeal. Okay, that's easy. You mix it in. The governor doesn't mind corn. It makes the pancakes gritty, like eating wet sand, but it works. But the cornmeal runs low. You look at the bag of dried beans. You try smashing them with a hammer and grinding them into a powder. You feed this bean dust to the jar. The governor bubbles sluggishly. He hates it. The smell changes from fresh brewery to wet dog in a locker room. But he stays alive. Then you get desperate. You look at the walls of your cabin. You look at the firewood, sawdust. This leads to a mainstream historical reality, the tree bread of famines throughout history, from medieval Europe to the siege of Leningrad. Starving humans have added wood pulp to their bread. It is cellulose. It is non-toxic mostly. It fills the stomach. It stops the hunger pangs. But in the Klondike, this wasn't just a filler for the dough. It was a filler for the culture. You scrape up a handful of clean pine sawdust from your wood chopping block. You grind it as fine as you can. You mix it with a little bit of real flour and water. You feed it to the jar. Does the yeast eat the wood? Number yeast can digest cellulose. But the sawdust provides a matrix, a structure for the few remaining starch molecules to hang onto. It bulks up the volume. You fry up a sawdust sourdough pancake. You take a bite. It tastes like a pencil. It is fibrous. You have to chew it for a long time. It scratches your throat going down. But when it hits your stomach, it expands. You feel full. It is a lie. But it is a comforting lie. But you can live on wood alone. You need nutrients. You remember seeing the caribou digging in the snow. They were eating something, moss. This brings us to a niche survivalist delicacy. Reindeer lichen, Cladonia rangiferina. You put on your snowshoes and trudge out into the gray twilight. You dig under the snow near the spruce trees. You find it, a pale, greenish, gray, coral-like fungus. It is crisp and frozen. You bring a basket of it back to the cabin. You can just put it in the bread raw. It is bitter and acidic. You have to boil it. You boil it in lye, wood ash water to neutralize the acid, then rinse it, then dry it, then crush it into a powder. It creates a mucilaginous, slimy flour. You feed this slime to the governor. The reaction is horrifying. The mixture turns a sickly green-gray. It looks like alien sludge, but the bubbles appear. The wild yeast in the lichen actually boosts the culture. You fry it. The resulting pancake is rubbery. It tastes like mushrooms and dirt, but it has carbohydrates. You are eating the landscape. As you chew your moss bread, you sit by the window and watch the trail. You see men walking back toward Dawson from the creeks. They look like skeletons. They are dragging sleds not with gold, but with nothing. This leads to a massive academic controversy, the starvation winter hoax. In the winter of 1897 to 1898, reports reached the outside world and the Canadian government that Dawson City was starving. There were riots. The warehouses were empty. The Mounties considered evacuating the entire population of 30,000 people down the frozen river to Fort Yukon, a death march that would have killed thousands. Campa, the realists, argues that the shortage was real. The river froze early. The supply steamers got stuck in the ice hundreds of miles away, and the population had exploded. People were genuinely eating dogs and boiling boots. Camp B, the conspiracy theorists, argues that the starvation was manufactured by the trading companies. Specifically, the Alaska Commercial Company, AC Company, and the North American Transportation and Trading Company, NATI. The theory is that these companies had food in their warehouses, but they hid it. They created an artificial panic to drive prices up. When the panic hit, flour went from $6 a sack to $100 a sack. Camp B points to diaries of miners who claimed that once the spring came, miraculously, the warehouses opened up and tons of rotten bacon and flour were dumped into the river because they could sell it in time. They let it rot rather than sell it cheap. You look at your empty flour sack. You feel a flash of rage. Is there a warehouse full of flour just 5 miles away, locked behind iron doors? Probably. But you can eat rage. You can only eat moss. You look at the governor. He has adapted. He is a survivor. He is digesting the bean dust and the moss slime. He has evolved from a delicate Seattle purebred into a rugged Yukon mutt. But something is happening to the liquid on top of the starter. Usually, a healthy starter has a clearish liquid on top if you neglect it. But now, the liquid is dark. It is gray. It smells dangerously alcoholic. You have pushed the biology to its limit. You are staring at the hooch. This isn't tea moonshine. It is the waste product of a stressed-out yeast colony. It is a signal that your pet is screaming for help. You have to make a decision. Do you stir it back in, or do you pour it off? And if you pour it off, do you drink it? You are lonely. You are cold. You haven't had a drink in 4 months. You look at the gray. Toxic. You are staring at the jar sitting on your rough-hewn table. The kerosene lamp casts a flickering, yellow light on the governor, making him look less like a pet and more like a science experiment. Gone wrong. Something has changed. The bubbly, happy paste you nurtured in Seattle is gone. In its place is a dense, gray sludge at the bottom, and floating on top of it is a layer of dark, murky liquid. It looks like dirty dishwater. It looks like the tears of a dying organism. You are looking at the hooch. This brings us to a mainstream historical and biological fact: the stress response. When a sourdough starter runs out of food, starches, the yeast, and bacteria stop reproducing. They enter survival mode. They continue to ferment, but they have nowhere to put their waste products. The liquid on top is essentially ethanol, alcohol, mixed with water and organic acids. It is the blood of the grape, minus the grape, plus a lot of funky bacteria byproducts. In a modern bakery, you would panic. You would say your starter has gone acidic or proteolytic. But in the Klondike winter, you look at that liquid and you see opportunity. You unscrew the lid. The smell hits you. It is no longer the sweet apple cider smell of a young starter. It is a punch in the face. It smells like nail polish remover mixed with old socks and very cheap vodka. It is the smell of desperation. Now, you have a culinary decision to make. Option A, pour it off. This removes the excess alcohol and acid, making your next batch of pancakes milder and sweeter. Option B, stir it back in. This retains the liquid, making the batter looser, but it concentrates the acid. Your pancakes will be so sour they will make your jaw muscles spasm. They will taste like a lemon soaked in vinegar. But there is a secret option C. You look at the liquid. You tilt the jar. The gray fluid pools at the lip. You haven't had a drink in 4 months. The saloons in Dawson are selling whiskey for $1 a shot, and half the time it's just wood alcohol colored with iodine. This liquid in your jar, it's natural. It's 100% organic. It's basically wheat wine. You hesitate. You lift the jar to your lips. You take a tiny sip. It tastes vile. It tastes like bile and yeast. It burns your throat, not with the pleasant warmth of whiskey, but with the sharp sting of acetic acid. You gag. You almost drop the jar. Okay, option C was a bad idea. You decide on option B. You grab a spoon and stir the hooch back into the paste. Why? Because you are angry. You are cold. You are bitter. You want your food to taste like you feel. You want that extreme sourness. You want a pancake that fights back. This leads to a niche, sensory detail. The Klondike kick. Old-timers. The real sourdoughs often preferred their bread to be aggressively sour. A mild bread was for women and children. A strong, lip-puckering sourdough was a sign of a mature pot. By stirring the hooch back in, you are lowering the pH of the dough significantly. This acidity actually helps preserve the bread. A super sour biscuit one, tea mold as fast as a sweet one. In a cabin where dampness is the enemy, acid is a preservative. You are chemically pickling your breakfast, but as you stir the gray sludge, a thought crosses your mind. Is this stuff actually good for you? Or are you slowly poisoning yourself? This brings us to a massive academic controversy, the scurvy tonic myth. Miners were terrified of scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. Their gums bled, their teeth fell out, their old wounds reopened. They tried everything to cure it. eating raw potatoes, drinking spruce tea. Camp Ah, the folk medicine believers, argues that the miners believed the fermentation liquid, the hooch, contained vital nutrients. They thought the sourness was akin to limes or lemons. There are anecdotal records of men drinking the hooch specifically as a medicine. Camp B, the nutritionists, argues that this is tragic nonsense. While yeast fermentation does produce some B vitamins like folate, it produces zero vitamin C. In fact, the alcohol and acidity might irritate the stomach lining, making it harder to absorb nutrients. Drinking the hooch was likely just making them drunker and sicker. However, Camp counters that the lactobacillus bacteria in the starter are probiotics. By consuming this raw, fermented soup, the miners might have been bolstering their gut health, helping them digest the terrible beans and moss bread, which indirectly kept them alive. You finish mixing the batter. It is thin and gray. You pour it onto the hot stove top. You don't even use a pan anymore. You just scrub the iron stovetop with a piece of pork fat and pour the batter right on the metal. Hiss, the smell fills the cabin. It's pungent. You flip the cake. It doesn't rise much. The yeast is tired. The hooch has inhibited the lift. It is a flat, dense disc of sour rubber. You eat it. It makes the glands under your ears ache. It is so sour it almost hurts, but it wakes you up. You look at the governor. He looks a little better after being stirred. The gray liquid is gone, integrated back into the whole. You realize that you and the jar are the same. You are both stressed. You are both starving. You are both becoming acidic and bitter. But you are both still bubbling. You have survived the hooch phase. You didn't throw it out. You integrated the bitterness. And because you have survived this winter, because you have kept this jar alive through the freeze, the famine, and the hooch, you are about to earn a title. You are no longer a Chichico, a newcomer. When the river melts in the spring, you will be one of the few, the proud, the smelly sourdoughs. But what does that name actually mean? Is it just about the bread, or is it something deeper? As the wind howls outside, burying your cabin in another foot of snow, you are about to learn that sourdough isn't just a recipe. It is a rank, and you have just passed the initiation. You are standing by the door of your cabin. The air smells different. It doesn't smell like frozen metal and despair anymore. It smells like wet earth and rotting pine needles. You hear a sound that you haven't heard in 6 months. Drip, drip, drip. The snow on your roof is melting. The Yukon River, which has been a silent highway of ice, is groaning again. The ice is breaking up. You walk to the riverbank. You watch the massive white slabs grinding against each other, floating downstream. You take a deep breath. You have done it. You have seen the river freeze in the fall, and you have seen the ice go out in the spring. You are no longer a chichaco. You are a sourdough. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact, the definition of a sourdough. In the lexicon of the North, there are only 2 types of people. A chichaco, a Chinook jargon word meaning newcomer, is someone who has arrived but hasn't survived a winter. They are green. They are naive. They probably still have clean fingernails. A sourdough is someone who has stuck it out. The term became synonymous with veteran. It wasn't just about what you ate. It was about what you endured. If you survived the darkness, the cold, and the beans without quitting, you earned the title. And the badge of your office is that jar of fermenting paste sitting on your shelf. You look at the governor. He has changed too. In Seattle, he was a clean, bubbly mixture in a clear glass jar. Now the jar is caked with layers of dried batter. The rim is encrusted with a concrete, hard ring of old flour. He looks like a science experiment that survived a war. This leads to a niche, slightly gross detail. The unwashed pot protocol. A true sourdough never washes his yeast pot. Never to a chichico. Your jar looks like a health hazard. It's covered in brown crust. It smells fierce. But to you, that crust is sacred. It is the mother. The dried batter on the rim and the lid acts as a seal, but also as a backup drive. If the wet culture inside dies or gets contaminated, you can chip off the dried crust, soak it in water, and resurrect the culture. The grime is your insurance policy. There were miners who used the same wooden bucket for 20 years. The wood itself became impregnated with the yeast culture. They could empty the bucket, let it dry, and 5 years later, add water to the empty bucket, and it would start bubbling again. The bucket was the yeast. You walk into town. The first steamers of the spring are arriving. Fresh chichacos are pouring off the boats. They look just like you did a year ago. Clean clothes, anxious eyes, way too much luggage. One of them approaches you. He sees your beard, which reaches your chest, your patched clothes, and your 1,000-yard stare. "Excuse me, sir," he asks nervously. "Do you know where I can buy yeast? The shop says they are out." You look at him, you feel a strange mix of pity and superiority. "You can't buy it, son," you say, your voice raspy from months of not talking. "You have to grow it. Or you have to be given it." This brings us to the social currency of the starter. In the Klondike, giving someone a scoop of your starter was a blood bond. It was the ultimate act of friendship. You were giving them a piece of your own survival. You invite the kid back to your cabin. You take the governor. You spoon out a generous dollop of the gray, bubbly goo into his clean tin cup. Feed it flour and water tonight. You instruct him. Keep it warm. Don't let it freeze. And for God's sake, don't name it until it makes its first pancake. The kid looks at the goo like it's gold dust. Does it have a name? "This is the governor," you say. "He runs this town." But why call the people sourdoughs? Why not bean eaters or ice men? This leads to an academic controversy, the hygiene versus cuisine debate. Campa, the culinary historians, argues the name is purely functional. These men ate sourdough bread 3 times a day. Every day, they carried the smell of yeast in their clothes because they were constantly frying it in small cabins with no ventilation. They literally smelled like bread. Camp B, the anthropologists, argues it was a derogatory term that was reclaimed. They suggest that sourdough referred to the sour smell of unwashed bodies. Sourdough fermentation produces acetic acid, vinegar, and lactic acid, sweat smell. A man who hasn't bathed in 8 months smells remarkably similar to an overproofed jar of starter. So, was the nickname a tribute to their baking skills? Or a polite way of saying, "You guys stink"? Camp B points out that in the early days, sourdough was sometimes used as an insult by the civilized administrators coming from Ottawa, but the miners took it and wore it like armor. "Yeah, I smell sour." That's the smell of survival. You smell like soap, which means you haven't done any real work. You watch the chichico walk away with his cup of the governor. You feel a sense of continuity. Your yeast is now colonizing a new cabin. The governor has offspring, but as you stand there, feeling proud of your veteran status, you feel a sharp pain in your leg. You limp slightly. You rub your shin. It feels bruised, but you haven't hit it. You run your tongue over your teeth. Your gums feel spongy. They taste metallic. You stop feeling proud. You start feeling scared. You have survived the starvation. You have filled your belly with sourdough pancakes every day. But pancakes are just flour and water. They are energy. but they are not nutrition. You haven't eaten a fresh vegetable in 7 months. You haven't eaten fresh meat in 4. You look at the jar of yeast. You thought it was keeping you alive, and it did. It kept you from starving to death. But it couldn't protect you from the other killer of the North, scurvy. You realized that while the governor kept your stomach full, he couldn't stop your body from slowly disintegrating. You need vitamin C, and you need it now. But there are no lemons in the Yukon. So, what do? You look at the trees, specifically the sharp, prickly needles of the spruce tree. You are about to brew the most disgusting tea in the world, based on a recipe that might save your teeth, or might just kill you faster. You are sitting on the edge of your bunk, poking your own leg. This sounds like a weird nervous habit, but it's actually a medical test. You press your thumb into the flesh of your shin. You take your thumb away. The dent stays there. It looks like you are made of memory foam. You walk to the small mirror you nailed to the wall. You bare your teeth. They look longer. They aren't actually growing. Your gums are receding. They are purple, spongy, and they bleed if you so much as look at them aggressively. And the worst part, a scar on your hand. A cut you got from a saw blade 6 months ago, which had healed perfectly, has suddenly opened up again. It's bleeding as if you just cut it yesterday. Welcome to scurvy. You thought the cold would kill you. You thought the rapids would kill you. But it turns out, the thing that is trying to kill you is the lack of a lemon. You look at the governor on the table. You feel betrayed. I fed you, you whisper. I kept you warm. I ate your sour pancakes every single day. And this is how you repay me. This brings us to a mainstream historical tragedy. The sourdough scurvy epidemic. The sour diet, flour, water, beans, and bacon, is a nutritional disaster. It is high in calories but devoid of vitamin C. The human body can only store vitamin C for about 3 months. You have been in the Yukon for 8. You are running on empty fumes. Miners tried to fix this with anti-scorbutics. They bought, in Seattle, bottles of lime juice that had been boiled so much they had no vitamins left, or crystallized citric acid, which was useless. They were drinking placebo juice while their bodies disintegrated. You are terrified. You have seen men die of this. They just lie down and fade away, or their hearts give out. You need a cure. And you can wait for the supply boats to bring oranges from California, which would sell for $1 each if they arrived at all. You remember a story an old Tlingit packer told you, back on the Chilkoot Trail, about the tree of life. You grab your axe. You stumble out of the cabin. You look for a spruce tree. Not just any spruce. You need the fresh, green tips or the bark. You chop off a branch. You drag it back inside. You strip the needles. You throw them into a pot of boiling water. This leads to a niche, culinary horror, spruce tea. You boil it until the water turns a murky, oily green. The smell fills the cabin. It doesn't smell like tea. It smells like turpentine. It smells like you are boiling a floor cleaner. You pour a cup. You let it cool. You take a sip. It is bitter. It is astringent. It tastes like you are drinking a Christmas tree that hates you. But you drink it. You force it down. And then you wait. This brings us to a massive academic controversy, the Cartier amnesia. Here is the maddening thing: Western science knew about this cure. In 1536, the French explorer Jacques Cartier was stuck in the ice in Quebec. His men were dying of scurvy. The local Iroquois people saved them by teaching them to make tea from the bark and needles of the annetta tree, likely white cedar or spruce. Cartier wrote it down. So, why, 360 years later, were thousands of educated American and British men rotting to death in the Yukon? Campa. The institutional arrogance theory argues that the medical establishment of the 19th century had become obsessed with germ theory and ptomaine poisoning. They thought scurvy was caused by bad meat or bacteria. They ignored the folk remedies of indigenous people because they viewed them as unscientific. Camp B, the communication breakdown, argues that the knowledge was simply lost in the noise. The cure for scurvy had been found and lost multiple times in history. Captain Cook knew it, but the British Navy later switched to cheaper, ineffective limes. The miners were victims of bureaucratic forgetfulness. You drink the tea for 3 days. On the 4th day, you press your thumb into your shin. The flesh springs back. You check your gums. The bleeding has stopped. You have just hacked your own biology using a tree branch. But now that you are feeling better, you look at the governor with new eyes. You realize that you were asking too much of him. He is a yeast colony, not a pharmacy. But just because he can tea cure scurvy, doesn't tea mean he is useless outside of breakfast. You look at the cracks in your cabin wall. The moss chinking has dried out and fallen away. The wind is whistling through. You look at the bucket of leftover sourdough batter, the stuff that got too crusty to cook. You have an idea. If this stuff dries as hard as concrete, can you build with it? This leads to the sourdough spackle phase of your life. You take the thick, gluey paste. You smear it into the cracks between the logs. It dries hard. It seals the draft. You realize that the governor is not just food. He is a multi-tool, and then you look at your boots. The leather is cracked. The snow is getting in. You remember seeing an old-timer rub something on his boots? Was it bear grease? Number it was. Dough? Here is a niche, weird fact. The sourdough poultice. Miners believed that sourdough had drawing power. If you had a splinter, or a boil, or a gunshot wound that was festering, you would slap a glob of raw sourdough starter on it and wrap it with a rag. The theory was that the fermentation drew out the poison. Modern science says, maybe, the acidity prevents some bacterial growth, and the moisture keeps the wound from drying out. But mostly, it was just accessible goop. You don't have a gunshot wound yet, but you do have snow blindness, burn on your face. You smear a little cool sourdough batter on your cheeks. It feels soothing. It dries into a crusty mask. You look in the mirror. You are a man wearing a mask of flour paste, drinking pine needle tea, living in a cabin, caulked with pancake batter. You have completely merged with your environment. You are no longer a visitor in the Yukon. You are a biological component of it. You, the spruce tree, and the yeast are now a symbiotic ecosystem. But spring is moving fast. The snow is gone. The ground is turning to mud. And with the mud comes the realization, you came here for gold. Remember gold? That yellow metal you haven't thought about in weeks because you were too busy trying not to lose your teeth. It's time to go to the creeks. It's time to take the governor to work. But mining isn't like the brochures. It's not picking nuggets off the ground. It involves fire, steam, and frozen gravel. And you are about to find out that sourdough isn't just a nickname for you. It is the only reason you will survive the disappointment of the cleanup. You are standing knee-deep in a muddy creek bed, holding a wooden trough that looks like a long, narrow coffin. This is a sluice box. It is late April. The sun is finally strong enough to melt the snow on the south-facing slopes. The creek, which has been frozen solid for 7 months, is starting to trickle. This is the moment you have been waiting for. This is the cleanup. All winter long, you have been digging dirt out of frozen shafts, piling it onto a dump next to your cabin. You haven't seen a single speck of gold yet because the gravel was locked inside frozen mud. But now, with the water running, you can wash that dirt and see if you are a millionaire or a fool. But you have a problem. You look at your sluice box. It was built from green lumber, trees you cut down yourself. As the wood dried over the winter, it shrank. The joints have opened up. There are cracks everywhere. If you pour water and gold-bearing gravel into this box, the water will leak out through the cracks, and the gold will go with it. You are panicking. You don't have caulking. You don't have tar. You don't have duct tape, because it won't be invented for another 40 years. You look at the only viscous, sticky substance you own. You look at the governor. This brings us to the sourdough as duct tape phase of your existence. You run back to the cabin. You grab the jar. You mix up a thick glue-like paste, flour, water, and a heavy dose of the starter. You make it almost like clay. You run back to the sluice box. You smear the paste into the cracks of the wood. You jam it into the joints. You let it dry in the sun. It hardens. It turns into a substance that is harder than the wood itself. It is nature, cement. This leads to a niche, architectural reality, the edible sealant in the Klondike. Sourdough wasn't just breakfast. It was the universal filler. Miners used it to chink the gaps in their log cabins when the moss fell out. They used it to seal the joints of their stovepipes, to stop smoke from filling the room. They used it to plug holes in their boots. It was the Bondo of 1898. Sure, if it got wet for too long, it would eventually get soggy. But for a quick fix, it was a miracle. You are literally building your fortune on a foundation of pancake batter. But the versatility of the governor doesn't stop at construction. You look at your hand. Mining is brutal. Your knuckles are cracked and bleeding from the cold and the gravel. You have a frost boil, a nasty festering sore caused by deep cold. On your cheek, you have no antibiotics. You have no Neosporin. So, you do what the old-timers told you to do. You take a glob of raw, fermented sourdough starter. You slap it directly onto the open wound. You wrap it with a dirty rag. This brings us to a massive academic controversy. The yeast poultice debate. Was this medical genius or dangerous quackery? Campa, the traditionalists, swears by it. They argue that the high acidity, low pH of the sourdough creates an environment where harmful bacteria, like gangrene or staph, cannot thrive. They also claim the yeast enzymes help digest the dead tissue, cleaning the wound. It is essentially a primitive antibiotic ointment. Camp B, the modern doctors, is horrified. They argue that putting raw flour and active yeast into an open wound is a recipe for a raging fungal infection or tetanus. They say any healing was likely due to the covering of the wound, not the goo itself. You don't care about the controversy. You just know that when you put the cool, sour paste on your throbbing frost boil, the pain stops. It feels soothing. It draws the heat out. You walk around the mining camp with a piece of dough plastered to your face, and no one bathes an eye. Half the men here are wearing similar bread bandages. You return to the sluice box. The sourdough seal has hardened. You open the floodgates. The creek water rushes into the box. You hold your breath. Does it leak? A few drops seep out, but the sourdough holds. The water flows over the riffles, the wooden slats designed to catch the gold. You start shoveling the pay dirt, the pile of gravel you spent all winter digging into the box. Scrape, splash, scrape, splash. You work for 18 hours straight. The sun barely sets. You are fueled by adrenaline and cold sourdough biscuits you keep in your pocket. This is the climax of the entire year. The trek from Seattle, the boat ride, the avalanche, the scurvy. It was all for this moment. You turn off the water. You look into the bottom of the sluice box. The gravel is gone. The rocks are washed away, left behind, caught in the wooden riffles. And maybe stuck to a bit of sourdough caulking is a layer of black sand. And sparkling inside the black sand. Yellow heavy, dull, beautiful yellow. You scream, you don't. Mean to, but it comes out as a guttural roar. You grab a nugget. It's the size of a wheat grain. You bite it. It's soft, it's gold. You run back to the cabin. You grab the governor. You want to hug the jar. You want to kiss it, because without this jar you wouldn't be here. You would have turned back at the Chilkoot. You would have starved in the cabin. You would have died of scurvy, or you would have leaked all your gold out of the sluice box. You sit down at the table. You are filthy, you are exhausted, and you are rich. Or maybe you aren't rich. Maybe you aren't rich. Maybe you only found an ounce. Maybe just enough to pay for your ticket home. But as you look at the jar, bubbling away in the warmth of the spring air, you realize something. The gold is just metal. You can spend it. You can lose it. But the sourdough is life. It regenerates. It grows. As long as you have flour and water, you have a future. You decide to make one last batch of pancakes. The victory batch. But this time, you aren't going to eat them alone. You hear footsteps outside. The spring thaw has brought new people. The river is open. The world is coming back to Dawson. And you have a story to tell them. You are standing on the deck of a steamship, watching Dawson City fade into the distance. It is July. The hills that were bare and muddy when you arrived are now covered in a carpet of purple fireweed, Epilobium angustifolium. The air is warm, buzzing with insects, and smells of river water and pine resin. You are going home. You look down at your hands. They are calloused, scarred, and permanently stained with the dirt of the Yukon. You check your pocket. There is a small pouch of gold dust there. Maybe it is a fortune. Maybe it is just enough to buy a nice suit and a steak dinner back in Seattle. Statistically speaking, you probably didn't strike the mother lode. Most didn't. The Klondike kings were few and far between. But you are leaving with something more valuable than the gold you missed. You are leaving with your life, And, of course, you are leaving with the governor. The jar is packed safely in your satchel, wrapped in the same red flannel underwear, now thoroughly washed. Hopefully that cradled it over the Chilkoot Pass. He has changed. 2. The culture inside that glass is no longer the simple mixture of Seattle flour and potato water you started with. He has evolved. He has picked up wild yeasts from the mountain air of the pass, bacteria from the moss you gathered in the starvation winter, and maybe even a few microbes from the river mist of the White Horse Rapids. He is a biological record of your entire journey. Every time you open that jar to bake a loaf of bread for your grandchildren, the smell that wafts out just be sourdough. It will be the smell of 1898. It will be the smell of adventure. This brings us to the final historical reality, the living legacy. While the gold mines were dredged out and the boom towns turned into ghost towns, the sourdough lived on. There are bakeries in Alaska and the Yukon today, and even families in Seattle and San Francisco who claim to possess 100-year-old starters that date back to the gold rush. Campe, the skeptics, argues that this is biological ship of Theseus nonsense. If you replace the flour and water every week, is it really the same starter? Camp B, the romantics, argues that yes, it is. The lineage is unbroken. A scoop of the governor given to a friend, who gave it to a friend, creates a web of connection that spans a century. You didn't just bake bread, you built a dynasty. The steamship whistle blows, a deep, mournful sound that echoes off the canyon walls. You lean against the railing. You see a Chichaco on the shore, struggling with a heavy pack, looking terrified. You want to yell at him. You want to tell him about the avalanche. You want to tell him not to buy the $5 egg. You want to tell him to put moss in his pancakes. But you don't. You just smile. He has to learn it for himself. He has to earn his name. You pat the satchel at your side. We made it, Governor, you whisper. Now let us go find some real butter. The current catches the boat. The city of gold disappears around the bend. The rush is over, but the rise is just beginning. And so the river widens and the current slows. The frantic energy of the gold rush is left behind, fading into the purple twilight of the north. You can stop moving now. You don't have to climb another mountain. You don't have to saw another log. You don't have to worry about the ice cracking under your feet or the fire going out in the night. Imagine you are back in a warm, safe kitchen. The oven is on, casting a gentle golden heat across the room. The air is filled with the most comforting smell in the world. The smell of baking bread. It's a deep, toasted, yeasty aroma that wraps around you like a heavy quilt. You are sitting in a comfortable chair. Your muscles, tight from months of shivering and hauling, are finally unspooling. Your shoulders drop. Your jaw unclenches. On the counter, under a clean linen cloth, a bowl of dough is rising. Rise and fall, rise and fall. It breathes slowly, just like you. It is in no hurry. It has all the time in the world. There is no rush anymore. The gold is just a rock. The cold is just a memory. You are warm. You are full. You are safe. Let the rhythm of the river and the slow breath of the dough rock you. Drift away from the Yukon. Drift into the warmth, sleep. The story ends here. Good night.